I was kind of a semi-normal or nearly normal young boy. I was 14 and sick at home one day, and it turned out I'd read every book in the house but one, which was my Algebra 1 textbook. And when I went back to school, I said to my high school math teacher, Mrs. Hunsicker, I said, there must be something wrong here. I read that whole book in 4 hours. It doesn't say anything. And she said, you know, it's funny, most people never notice that. So that's how I learned that I had this ability in mathematics, and there was this whole other world that I kind of got sucked into that was beautiful. I had 6 years in graduate school with all A's. On the doctoral exam, I got 100 points more than anybody else, and then one day, I graduated. I was supposed to go off to MIT because MIT was the number 3 place in the United States. And I got there and it was cold and there was no beach. And so I said, no, I want to go to Berkeley. Just kind of by coincidence, the Unabomber had been there and he had a 2-year appointment and he had just dropped out. So there was an opening. So I went to Berkeley. I spent 2 years there, but I decided I needed some time off. I've been in the university since I was 16, now I was 29, and I met a young lady from Hawaii, and so we came and we lived together for a year on the beaches, riding our bicycles around, and then she fell in love with a saxophone player, which is one of those things that happens. About 50 years ago, a man named Abraham Robinson invented a logically consistent system of infinitesimals. For a while, he felt that my work was the most beautiful work that had been done with his method. And so I had my 15 minutes of fame. He talked about me in all of his lectures. And in the jungle and wherever I was, I'd written 4 papers, which I sent off to Abraham Robinson. So after I was here for 3 years, I decided it was time to go back. And I got a letter back from his secretary saying he died of cancer. So I got stranded because it was only this one man that thought I had done incredible stuff. Nobody else would have understood any of it or cared about it. Someone said that someone out here had a piece of land in the jungle they wanted to sell. He brought me out here up this trail, and it was just like Tarzan. I mean, I had no way to relate to it all except for Tarzan. And so we shook hands there in the jungle, and so I came out and just started hacking at the jungle. And just kind of wrapped up in a piece of plastic at night, and then I'd walk up to the road and hitch into town. And I didn't have any money at the time, so I would just wait until something happened and I wound up having a box of food again, and I'd come back out and do it all over again. I had one once this size, like this, and I cut it with a chainsaw like this, and it came back, and I threw myself back, and it came like that, and it hit another branch right there just before it hit my head. It would just taken my head off. Everybody clears, they use a big machine and you just push it. But if you did that, you'd destroy those 15-year-old Hawaiian loe, the walls. And the only way to not do that is to do it by hand. But that's insane. I mean, I have maybe 10 years of work to clear that. I mean, no sane person would do that. So no Hawaiian was going to do that. So I wound up with the land. When I first came here, like 40 years ago, twice I was talking to an old Hawaiian, and they would start telling me about partying when they were young, until the Howley thing took over. And all of a sudden you could hear it in the way they were talking, what true freedom was. It was like a whole reality. It was like, wow, I don't have a clue what that was. We're enslaved inside of our heads without knowing it, without being able to see it. We're crippled. They call us Howleys. And Hali means without breath or without soul. And part of it is, you know, like, hi, and we're in our brain someplace, right? But Hawaiians like that. They grab you and give you a big bear hug, right? I mean, you know, they're so real. It's so wonderful. So this was my escape. Out here, you can just be whatever you are. Sometimes I say, I spent 13 years in the university learning how to think. Now I have to spend the rest of my life learning how to not think. You know, you'd like to think that you paid your dues, not by owning something or anything else, but just because you've given it your love and your energy. You know, people ask, you know, you studied mathematics in the university for 13 years. What do you use it for? And it just makes me cringe. I say, it's like, do you ask Bach if he can design door chimes? It was beautiful. It was a beautiful experience. It is a beautiful experience. Mathematics is this whole world of the pattern, the beauties behind all of that. And it's only by intimacy with it means, you know, you study it, you learn it, you understand it, you're being with it. And it's the same thing with beauty. I mean, you can't see beauty unless you're intimate with it. Maybe I need all this incredible beauty and stuff around me to have a feeling of wealth. I don't know. This was a chance to do something that was just basically pure the art of life. Everything about here is bizarrely impractical. There were wild pigs running through all here. At one point, about 2 months ago, about 20 of them surrounded my house all night long. And you could hear this all night long, from sunset to sunrise. It was like one of those horror movies. And I went out with this machete. I went out and I saw this big boar and I looked at him and he looked at me and I went back in the house. They would have just ripped me to shreds. This was fairly recent growth, but we're sort of heading off more into the edge of where I actually cleared, and so things get thicker. You can see when you get into this stuff, it's harder to figure out how in the world to actually even get through it. Personally, I think it was kind of an insane thing to do. The old house, the one that fell down, originally at one point I built it all out of bamboo. You can tell by the texture, like if it's a young one and you cut it, it'll just rot. If you need a really old one. And then we'd run it through a fire to try to push the sap out. And then I painted it with 3 coats of spar varnish and I built a whole house out of it. And then I got moldy, it didn't work. The basic thing is we have hands. We've had hands for millions of years. And what are hands for? You know, if you have hands, you grab things, you hold them, and you manipulate them. And so our whole conceptual being is in terms of that. Our concepts that we have, our meaning that we have, we hold it, we grasp it, and we manipulate that. We do that with everything, and that's the way our science is, and that's the way everything is. And the point is that's leading us to the edge of a cliff. Logic and this grasping has served this huge function, basically creating cement in people's heads. You know, in this case, it's becoming lethal because we're destroying the planet. You know, there's too much cement that's not allowing us to think in a new way. What the whole culture needs right now is how to find wealth without needing to exploit everything. And it's the whole thing where science can become more holistic. There was a schism of math about 200 years ago. Before then, math all had to do with how the world worked. And then there became this incredibly abstract math. And it split in 1850 when Lobachevsky made this hyperbolic geometry. The simple thing was that humans somehow got to the point of knowing what numbers are. People have expanded their concept of a number to include negative numbers, and we've expanded them to fractions. But it turns out that you can expand your concept of numbers beyond that to include direction, vectors like arrows. And if you do that, a huge amount of the explanation of the universe and math comes from that, being able to expand your consciousness of number to include direction. In our everyday life, what's obvious is what worked evolutionarily. But what's really obvious once you get outside of that and experience the world, it might not correspond to that at all. When you study things holistically, there's things now with massive data, you can learn things that you don't understand how they actually work. We may, for instance, create conscious beings, but we won't understand how they work. Outside of the human mind, there's this immense universe, and it's got nothing to do with human emotions. There's no push me, pull me. The world out there, outside of human minds, is basically, in some sense, pure mathematics. I'm not very musical. I can't sing. I can't even sing a note. I'm just not musical, but somehow this music is incredibly beautiful. There's two strains of spirituality. One of them is just loving what's beautiful and positive. But the other one is in transcending that and seeing everything as beautiful and positive. My dad used to say to me, well, what if everybody lived like you? I just couldn't live that life.
Do you feel lonely sometimes?
Yes, sometimes you would feel lonely. I mean, I think that having a partner in life is an utterly ideal, beautiful thing, to be somebody that's your lifelong friend, that you're intimate with. But maybe that's not my karma. I've been intimate and fallen in love several times. My father's father left him when he was 11 years old. So when I was young, he used to say, who do you think you are, a star boarder? It's his house. Everything is his, and it was. So, I just left. When I was 16, I just left. One day, when I was at Little Beach, it was this absolutely gorgeous day. It had been flat over there for a week or so, in Kona winds. And it was just crystal clear and flat. And I'd swum naked almost all the way around to the next beach. And I swam into a mass of Portuguese man-o-war. Portuguese man-o-war are not these big things, but they're these little things that float on the surface, and they have all these long tendrils that go down. They're like strings, and they stick on you, and they shoot little harpoons into you, and the harpoons have a protein that attaches to your pain receptors and fires your pain receptors off at maximum. And the reason they do that is if a fish swims into those tentacles, if it's just one swish of its tail, it would just rip them all apart. But it's so paralyzed by the pain that it can't react, and it's just paralyzed there. So I swam into a huge mass of these that had been blown by the winds, the southern winds in. And I was naked, so I took 3 handfuls off my genitals, and I looked under the water, and there's a ball about this big of mass of these things I ripped off of me, and they were all over my body. Fortunately, I was right next to the shore, and I crawled into this little spot. This is a really isolated spot where there's nothing around. And I crawl into this little spot, and looking out on this crystal clear, beautiful day, there's no human thing I can see. It's just the island like it might have been for a few million years. If you got into a fear state or anger state or anything like that, you'd be dead in like 20 seconds. You would just rip things apart. So it was like 1 second, and if you got through that second, then you get to the next one. But I was in the sun, and the sun was unbearable. There was a little bit of shade, and I'd throw myself into there. And then after about 3 or 4 seconds, I'd get claustrophobia, and I'd have to throw myself out back in the sun. So I spent an hour throwing myself in and out of this piece of shade and just screaming. And after about an hour, the pain went down just a little bit, enough so that I could crawl out on a rock. I realized that what saved my life was that the background feeling wasn't anger or fear, but it was this peculiar Buddhist thing that I felt like all the people in the world that had ever been tortured, that it feels like there's so many people and beings right now that are in such incredible suffering. And it just feels like for a moment I opened the door to their presence. You never really had your father's love. They weren't capable of love for a very long time, was incapable of loving you, because they were both so armored and they could never break through that. That's a lot of pain in that. And maybe without that pain, it's difficult to feel other people's pain.
Guru Pema Siddhi Hum Hum Hum.
I spent probably 12 years hanging out with the Lama. So I studied Tibetan. I learned at least the religious script so that I knew what I was saying. Kala Rinpoche was his teacher, and he had him stay in Paia. Every time he'd see me, he'd pat my pocket and he says, "You got money, you got money," because he knew I had that block against money. He was here. Those are pictures of him when he visited. He spent the night here, and he said, "You just stay here." He says, "There's billions of beings here. You just take care of all of these beings, and then one day you'll find the wish-fulfilling stone." That's what the Mani stone, what Chenrezig has in his hands, and then all riches will come to you. But what the Mani stone symbolizes is great equanimity. Everything that comes to you is incredible richness, no matter what it is. But it also, you're not there yet, so it's a path, and so that path, it also symbolizes the guru, that all true teaching comes from moving towards great equanimity. This is my Lama. When he died, he had a blockage tumor. About a week before he died. And we were at the Dharma Center in Paia, and he looks at me, he says, "When I die," he says, "I'm going far, far away." He says, "When Michael dies, they've got to come to his land and have a big party for him, and then somebody's going to say, 'Shh, shh, shh, Michael doesn't like noise,'" teasing me that I was attached to my land, and he wasn't. So that was one of his final lessons. In Buddhism, there's two things: emptiness and compassion. Compassion is a choice. You choose to be loving. You choose that. But Emptiness is something different. Emptiness is basically seeing the world the way that it really is. It's not being subject to delusion, or at least knowing when you're subject to delusion. The Lama said that a fool that knows he's a fool is only half a fool. The fundamentals of quantum mechanics, the absolute basis of it, is what they say when things are indistinguishable. You know, a photon or electron not having inherent existence radically changes the way it behaves. If something can happen in two different ways, if they're not distinguishable, you get interference, and all these bizarre things that happen in quantum mechanics are when things are indistinguishable. You know, in Buddhism, it's the same thing. You know, oh, we're all enlightened, we're perfect the way they are. But on the other hand, in reality, the way we act like we're not. And in essence, it's the same thing. It's because we're totally entangled with our environment. The reason that our everyday world is classical is that basically everything becomes distinguishable because of the light. Everything is being entangled with its environment constantly. You know, so it appears to have inherent existence. It acts as if it has inherent existence. Everything that's a deep conception of reality is in terms of two things that are the opposites, that are mutually contradictory. You know, the wave and particles. You know, here's you're an enlightened person, and here you're this entangled, trapped in samara. You know, they're two opposite views. They contradict each other. But you need both of them to describe reality. That's the Copenhagen Convention. And the fact that you want to grab one or the other and say they contradict each other, that's not being alive. Because that's not the way the world really is. That's what that's what the discovery of quantum mechanics says, is that a deep reality can't be described that way. About 600 BC, Buddha said, let's try to understand the world by seeing the simplest possible thing we can do, which is to do nothing. So that's meditation. And we do nothing and we look. At the same time, in Greece, they said, what's the simplest thing we can think about? And this, if things are logically consistent, as long as we stay within logical consistency, we can actually come with a conclusion. We won't just talk at each other for a lifetime. And so these traditions, starting with Pythagoras and through Euclid, have led to Western science, and Buddhism has continued in that way. So what's the core belief system, the core concept in Buddhism is called sunyata, or emptiness, which has different definitions, but two of them are that things don't exist in the way they seem to exist. They seem to be one thing, but actually there's something else. So that's this vast philosophical system. They also call that seeing reality as it actually is. So you go out in the evening and you watch the sunset. You don't go out in the evening and watch the earth rotate. Even though we've known this for 500 years, we still don't see it. So that's an example of something that's existing as something different than it seems to. It seems to be the sun moving, but actually it's the earth rotating, right? So even deeper thing that science has, which was totally incomprehensible to people, but since the movie The Matrix, now people understand, is that this world out here isn't the external world. It's not. It's a representation in our mind. There's nothing out there that corresponds to what you see. There are no colors outside of the human mind or outside some mind. What is this model? This model is that there's this three-dimensional space, and there are objects in the space, and at any particular moment, an object is a particular space, and in another moment, like 3 seconds later, maybe it's in another space. And there's that has two properties. One is that if this was here and it moves here, it has to move through a continuous path, a smooth path to get there. And the other one is that two objects can't be in the same place at the same time. So that's the model that we're immersed in. We see as external reality, even though it's part of our mind. But the thing is that was built up by evolution. It was built up so that our ancestors could survive and reproduce, and for no other reason at all. It's inherently what we're actually seeing out there is the wisdom of our ancestors. much more than any kind of external world, right? But the thing is all of our ancestors were basically about this size. I mean, 50 million years ago they might have been real tiny, but none of them were ever the size of an atom or a subatomic particle. So this model that we've built up by evolution, because it worked for the last few hundred million years, there's no reason whatsoever, no a priori reason why it should work at the size of an atom. And of course, it wouldn't make any difference if the smallest thing you could see was about 1/10 of a millimeter. But now that we can actually manipulate things at the level of an atom, we find out that it simply doesn't work. May what lies between clear light be self-aware. Buddhas of the 3 times, through your compassion, may the mind of all beings like me be freed. I'd worked and worked and worked and worked here, and my back got really messed up. And I really needed some therapy. And so I started swimming long distances, swimming a few miles along the coast. Then I discovered the dolphins. I was sleeping on the beach. I'd get up a couple hours before sunrise and do yoga. And then it was a 2-mile hike if I went along the road to where the dolphins were, or it was about a 4-mile hike if I went around the edge of the lava flow. And then you'd be coming around and there'd be the bay and you could see if the dolphins are in there. And it was like an amazing thing. I mean, basically to be able to live on this beach and go swim with the dolphins every day in America. So these guys are swimming, and I'm watching them on the bottom, and I see for sure there's one bigger than all the other ones. And then I realized that if he moves his head, everybody moves. If he moves his head that way, everybody moves. If he speeds up, everybody speeds up. And I'm swimming with this, and I'm watching that, so I just, without thinking about it, automatically just get into responding to what he's doing. And so I accidentally put myself totally in his control. And so for half an hour, he just had control of me, and then all of a sudden, they're on the bottom. He comes up off the bottom and accelerates, coming straight at me, and he leads the whole pod. And a few minutes later, they're below me, and he's lined them all up shoulder to shoulder in a line, with me right in the center. So I figured that was sort of my initiation into the pod, that you just do what the headman says and you're okay, That was the rules. In their motions, it's very, very, very mathematical, very geometric. They're always moving, and they move in a way to include you. And you realize how harsh it is to be around people. Some people with their body language include you, but every place you are, people are excluding you with their body language, not even consciously. They're just incredibly polite. My conceptualization was, I look in our human minds, and it looks like half of the emotions are adaptations to scarcity. This is my land, this is my food, this is my car, this is my money, this is my woman. But these guys don't have that. They're hunting on these schools of millions of fish. He says their problem is the tiger shark. And the adaptation to the tiger shark for these guys, because they're not big enough to defend themselves alone, is being in that pod. And since they can only sleep half their brain, they're in that pod 24/7. If you're not a good social being, you're going to get thrown out of the pod and you're going to die. So they've had millions of years to, their adaptation for survival is politeness. If you learn a few tricks, then you're more fun to play with. So they'd like to come and they'd swim around you in a circle. And I had these hand paddles on, so I'd curl on my side and I'd go like this like crazy, so one could put its head right in front of me and then spin me like a top. And then, just to make it more interesting, they'd get you spinning good, and then all of a sudden they'd try to change the axis and make you spin at a different angle, right? Which was really, really fun, but the only problem is that these guys can jump up in the air and do a dozen spins and come down. That's what they're good at. That's why they're called spinners. But you spin around a few dozen times like this and you start to throw up. So I had thrown up a couple times, And there was this one time where I just got to the point where I was going to throw up, and I go, I'm not going to do it again. Nope. And all of a sudden, it comes wham like this, and I go, okay. And then I'm like, whoa, and it comes again, ah, okay. And I let him get ahead of me, and I went over the tail. So now what's happened is we're changing the game. So now he changed the game. And what he changed the game to was I was swimming overhand and hard. He put his tail right in front of my head and started swishing back and forth through my hands. And so he's got all his buddies, the other juveniles, and they're watching this, and so they come in and they start body slamming him on the side to just throw his rhythm off, right? So all of a sudden I got a half dozen dolphins. So that became the game I played with him. I did that like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And that was the most fun thing I've ever done in my whole life. That was just incredible. It's just too much fun to be able to stop. That's just what happened. You know, I didn't support myself. I was just there. How much money would it take to be able to spend 5 years going every day swimming with the dolphins? You know, most people, they can afford a week in Hawaii, and maybe they're lucky if they get a day swimming with the dolphins. To be able to go for 5 years every day and swim with the dolphins, that's karma. You can't, no amount of money could afford that. You know, you just have to have your freedom. There was one day I was in the bay, and that day the dolphins were just with me, were super friendly. They started swimming out of the bay. And it's like 3.5 miles around to the next place we can get out of the water. They started swimming out of the bay, and so I stopped. Well, and they're continuing, and they turned around and came back to get me with it. So I swam with the waves, and I stopped again. They came back to get me again, and I didn't go. I was already pretty tired, and then they came a third time, and then I stopped, and then they didn't come back. And it turned out that the people from all along the coast were saying that different pods kept coming together. They went along the whole coast until there were, you know, a couple thousand dolphins, and then they headed off. There was some massive party, something going on, and they'd invited me. And I could have gone with them, and it was this exquisitely beautiful day. Of course, you wouldn't have survived. It was, but still, I always regretted that I didn't go. It would have been so special. I like to feel vital and alive, and I like to feel an intimacy with the world and with people. The Buddhist principle is that we're surrounded by zillions of Buddhas, but they can't have any contact with you because you're not open to them. But if you ever open up, it's all there. Everything here was built for the moment, for the experience, for the I didn't know what I'm doing. I built this house. I never built a house before. I don't know what I'm doing. It just seemed like a trippy thing to do at the time. Evolution is a process of iteration. There's no plan. There's no master plan. It's in each moment of what happens. My life is a process of iteration. You know, I was never smart enough or felt adult enough to have a plan for my life. So there's nothing to accomplish. What's going to happen after me to this? I presume it just goes back to the jungle, because who in the world would do this kind of work? I mean, what an incredible thing that you could have this much beauty. I mean, if you want to buy a Van Gogh, it's going to cost you $100 million. And is it really prettier than this? The mathematics that the universe is designed on is beautiful. If you can see the beauty in every being, then you can appreciate and love every being. We humans are drowning in a sea of things, complexity, stress, ideas. complexity has been woven into the fabric of our soul. Just play, just be. Jump in with love. Swim in bliss. Say an Om and a prayer.